Hello, hello. Welcome to the Drupal 7 End of Life podcast live from DrupalCon. I'm Mark Dorson, and here with me, I have Dave Look.
Hey, everybody.
So, a lot of announcements happened this week. We're going to talk through them and recap what was shared with regard to Drupal 7. Before we get into that, quick note, if you are responsible for a Drupal 7 site or many Drupal 7 sites, then you're faced with the challenge of upgrading or migrating before end of life. There's lots of resources out there, but you don't have to go it alone. We've compiled resources for you on our site. I'll drop a link in the show notes, and Chromatic is offering a free 45-minute working session to help you assess your risk level, identify options, and roadmap your transition plan. So if that's of interest to you or anyone you know, check out our Drupal 7 page, and you can always reach out to me directly. Let's talk Drupal 7 at DrupalCon 2023 Pittsburgh.
So, Mark, you went to the Security Council meeting yesterday. Is that correct?
Yes, so there was no mention of Drupal 7 during the Dries note, but there
Right.
was a security team panel on the agenda for that afternoon, Monday afternoon. And it was specifically, in addition to the normal security team topics, that's a session they hold every year. But in addition to that, we knew that they were going to be talking Drupal 7 end of life.
So, drum roll, please. You're holding us in suspense here. I
Okay,
mean,
okay.
presumably a lot of people already know, but like for anybody that doesn't know, what don't I know?
So the big news was that Drupal 7 end of life is being extended. It's being extended until January 5th, 2025, which is
Wow.
about 18 months or so from now. And it's about 14 months longer than what the previous end of life date is.
And did they share any of their reasoning behind that decision, or was it just we need more time?
Well, I think that the other big note that came along with that date was that it will not be extended. They're
Mm.
drawing a line in the sand that they did not do before. Probably everybody listening remembers that the previous announcement that announced the November 2023 date said, this is the date, but we leave ourselves the option of changing our minds 6 months out. So this July. This time they're saying there will absolutely not be an extension. This is the final date and we are not going back on it. So I think from their perspective, that is the biggest change with this announcement, that people can count on that date and plan for that date and not have some level of uncertainty or betting on the idea, like gambling on the idea that, like, well, it might be that date, but I'm gonna bet on the idea that they might not extend it. That's not going to be the case here.
It feels like a final file, though, to me. Like, I kind of feel like I'm still in that. I want to see some of the other things that have been talked about. I'm curious about those things that have been proposed. We've talked at length about the soft landing initiative. We've talked about migration paths. What is the Drupal Association? What is the security team? What are they proposing? And what does that mean for this actual final date that's been proposed?
Well, there's a few other smaller pieces to it. I think that the Drupal Association is starting a migration partner program, and from what I understand so far, the idea of that is to connect organizations that need help moving on from Drupal 7 with agencies or developers, depending on the size of the site, to agencies or developers whose expertise is in that area and can help them move past Drupal 7 or onto something else. They were explicit in my discussions that it's not a requirement to be a part of that program, that on the client side, on the project side, that it has to be, you must be moving to Drupal 10 to be in this
Hmm.
program or get help. Like, the purpose is to help people move past Drupal 7, which is end of life will be approaching. And ideally, if it's well suited to it, Drupal 10 is a great option for them. But there might be instances or sites where that doesn't necessarily make sense in the same way it did 10 years ago. And that's an option too. It's all about helping people make that transition with end of life approaching.
That's great. Have they released any of the details on that, or that was just an announcement of the
That was an
partner program?
announcement. There's an email that you can reach out to. So it's partnerships at association.drupal.org. and folks can reach out there to get more info on the program and I guess what it takes to be a part of it. There are also some smaller policy changes that are going to go into effect mostly related to security and the security team and Drupal 7. So these policies, we've talked before about what's going to happen when we actually reach end of life. There won't be commits, there won't be security announcements, there won't be Drupal 7 modules covered by the security team. But these policy changes are going into effect now. They're going into effect between now and end of life. And there's going to be more details shared, an announcement from the security team. But some general overview is that there are some types of security issues that will no longer be addressed in private, some lower risk vulnerabilities, specifically around information disclosure, I think denial of service. When you submit a security report to the security team, they give it a score. So they have a matrix essentially that they go through for different areas of the vulnerability. Does it affect, could anyone without authentication access this vulnerability, things like that. And so they determine like what is the level of risk. So this shows up, people might notice in security announcements, they'll have a rating that'll say extremely critical or moderately critical or something like that. That is where that comes from. So in these specific areas, incident security reports that are graded on the lower end of that scale might not be handled in private like the typical security processes. And that's based on a determination by the security team that like this is adding a high volume, a high level of work to their plates for certain types of vulnerabilities that, in their opinion, don't necessarily warrant it. So that's going to change now. They're also not going to address any Drupal 7 vulnerabilities that are Windows only. So if there are vulnerabilities reported that only show up on Windows, that's not going to be somewhere that they spend their time. That's, I think, less relevant these days than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, when Drupal 7, or more than 10 years ago, in 2011, when Drupal 7 launched, it was not common, but more common than now for Drupal sites to be run sometimes on Windows web servers. Oftentimes,
Right.
this is in organizations where there might be like an organization wide requirement to run on all Windows machines, for example.
Yep.
But
Yep.
nowadays, with containerization, it's much more common, even if that type of requirement is still in place at an organization, they can run a Linux container on a Windows machine and run Drupal within Linux. So it's much less, even much less common these days for production Drupal sites to be running directly on Windows IIS web server. So they're not going to spend time on those. There might be third-party libraries that are reaching end of life, CK Editor 4, for example, but others as well. They're not going to address issues with that and provide security support for that. And there's
Right.
also, last but not least, there's not going to be a vendor support plan after end of life. I think there was with Drupal 6, and there was talk of it with Drupal 7 for a while, but with the amount of time that's passed, they're not going to be pursuing that. We should note this will be, again, the end of life date's going to be January 5th, 2025. That's also an anniversary for Drupal 7. Drupal 7 was released on January 5th, 2011. So 14 years, Drupal 7 has been supported by the security team and the Drupal Association. So it's had a good long life. And I get the impression that that's why they feel very confident in this date.
Yeah.
And we've been talking about it now for a while, long before we had the podcast, but now with the podcast as well. And so I don't think anyone's surprised at this point about Drupal 7 end of life. So they feel confident that this is the date, this is what we're going with, and they're going to roll with it.
I definitely have a couple questions I want to ask you as a CTO, but I think there's one other point that I heard, which is that the unsupported contrib modules. Can you talk about that? There's a transition for the modules that were not going to be part, or they don't have support for Drupal 10, and something's going to happen with those. Can you talk about that, Mark?
Yeah, to explain the way it works for all contributed modules, if there's a security issue reported for a contributed module, the security team reaches out to the maintainers in private and notifies them and facilitates the resolution of that issue. They don't work on the fix, but they facilitate getting the people that could help involved when there is no response from a maintainer, any of the maintainers of a module, after a certain period of time, they will mark the module as unsupported. Now, what happens with someone shows up and says, hey, this is a module that's important to me. I'm willing to be a maintainer, and they can go through a process to request and gain maintainership on that module to help resolve the security issue and then take over and help that process. That's no longer going to happen for Drupal 7 modules between now and end of life. So if they get to the point where they've tried to collaborate with a maintainer and they're not getting a response and there's no one else available, on all the maintainers haven't responded, and they mark that module as unsupported, they're not going to go through the process of, and then later someone shows up and asks to be a maintainer. They're not going to entertain that process between now
Wow.
and Drupal 7 end of life. So that module will remain marked as unsupported. So their call to the people who have Drupal 7 modules that they rely on critically is request maintainership now. Go through the process, request to become a co-maintainer so that you are on the list when a security issue is reported. You're going to get that private notification. You're going to be involved in the security issue queue, and you can help shepherd that process. And so do that now, because once a Drupal 7 module is marked unsupported, it's not going to go back the other way between now and end of life. That's just all of these processes and tasks take a lot of time and take a lot of overhead and back and forth, and they're just trying to limit that impact between now and end of life.
And you said that was going to be August 1st. Is that going to be August 1st of 2023 or 2024?
That's my understanding, is that's going to begin August 1st, 2023.
Wow. Okay. So this is quick. So we need to act. If we have unsupported Drupal 7 modules that you're relying on, we need to act on those relatively quickly.
Yeah, I would check what's confirmed in their security team announcement, but that was my understanding. They were feeling like the need to get moving with this.
Makes sense. So, okay, we now have a fixed end of life date for Drupal 7. We have some known processes or some proposed processes for the security process moving forward here. How does this make you feel as a CTO? You are both a CTO and you're a software architect. You've been working with Drupal for a long time. From that side of things, does this frighten you? Does this feel good? How are you feeling related to this announcement?
I think there are trade-offs with any of this stuff. I think it's clear to me that this date needs to come at some point. We have to go to end of life, I think, based on all of the input, all of the conversations we've had with people involved, the Drupal Association, people that we've spoken to on this podcast. And I think they've given people a long runway, and they have made very clear now that it's not going to be extended. So I think when all of our discussions, that was a surprisingly maybe a big deal, considering it was just a few words in that previous announcement, but people latched onto that. People latched onto the idea that maybe it's going to get extended again. Well, it's not going to get extended again. I feel okay about that. I think that there's still work to do around helping people make the transition off of Drupal 7, wherever it is that they're going to end up. And whether hopefully that is to, Drupal 10 for sites that warrant it. But even if it's not, I think there's more that we can do to help them make that transition, whether it's to Backdrop, whether it's to something else. I think that it's the best selection out of a choice of bad options.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we've known this was coming, as you said, and at some point you have to put a stake in the ground to say this is going to be the end. And this gives us enough time to do planning. And really, if you think about it from a business side of things, is typically where my mind goes, less than on the technology side, is this gives us time to go through. Some organizations will need to go through an RFP cycle so they can get those rolled out this year. They've got budgeting for 2024. They can roll this into their plan. They can roadmap it. They might even be able to roll a redesign into this so that people see more with that transition. So it feels like strategically from a business side of things, this extension will buy us time with a firm date. To your point, there was no little caveat, we might change our minds. Like, this actually does feel final. And that feels like we can work towards that.
Yeah. So I think for all the reasons you mentioned, it's important on the business side. And that really highlights that we need to get started now. on these items. Like, I don't think my takeaway from this announcement is not, oh, we can wait a year and then start thinking about this. Now is the moment to start those discussions. On the technology side, I think there's an opportunity for us to continue the tools around moving from Drupal 7 to modern Drupal haven't progressed in a big way in a while. And we talked with Matt Glaman last week about Drupal Bridge, and that was released yesterday. It has been renamed to Retrofit, which I think is a
Oh,
great
cool.
name.
Yeah,
So you
yeah.
can install Retrofit on your Drupal 10 site. It is a composer package. And then with Retrofit, you can copy over a Drupal 7 module into your Drupal 10 site, enable the module, and for a big chunk of the functionality, it'll work out of the box. So things like forms, all kinds of stuff like that. Matt has some videos that he shared. We'll add to the show notes where he shows it working with Drupal 7 code running in Drupal 10. It's kind of wild, but that's an example of whether it's retrofit and we push retrofit even further forward, or other things, maybe on the theme side. I don't know if there's possibilities to evolve that tooling, helping people get further along in the process, making it easier to move from Drupal 7 to Drupal 10. If we can even decrease the complexity, decrease the effort involved by 40%, that could be a big deal. If all
Yeah.
organizations needed to do was push a button to move to Drupal 10, they would have done it already. The reason why that's not the case, and the reason why many of these places haven't done that, is because they've looked at the potential cost involved and then looked at what they're getting for that cost, what their users are going to see. Yes, they're moving to a more modern version of a great product in Drupal, and they're keeping their security support and things like that. But what does it do for their users? You do all this work, and well, the site works the same way that it did before. It
Right.
looks the same way that it did before. If you don't roll a redesign into the effort, but that's even more work. So if we can reduce the effort involved by a decent chunk, I think it can move the needle for some of these sites, which is going to be valuable, and then that's valuable to Drupal as a project as well.
Right. Right. When I think about that from an organizational standpoint, I'm still curious to know the why. Why are people still on Drupal 7 beyond the complexities of upgrading to Drupal 10? Are there other variables? And one of those variables that has struck me is the development teams that might be embedded at these organizations. So what else could we be doing to level up those teams to prepare them for Drupal 10? Because I think that, speaking as somebody that did development in Drupal 6 and Drupal 7, that jump to go from Drupal 7 to Drupal 10 can be intimidating the first time you do it. So again, maybe that's a topic for another time, but I feel like that kind of falls into this conversation, which is how does that apply when we're talking about the things that aren't seen in an upgrade? So that's almost like collateral damage in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it might be warrant an episode unto itself. I think the problem is in some ways bigger than Drupal. We're talking about going from procedural PHP to object-oriented PHP. To some people, especially people that had some kind of like computer science background, education, formal education, that's more natural for me, for example. But other
Mhm.
people that came to Drupal, came to PHP, and their very first exposure to programming was like, hey, let me crack this open and,
Yeah.
use an example. And without those like higher level concepts, it's a big jump
Yeah.
to wrap your brain around it. So I think it's a achievable jump. I believe in all these folks that they can wrap their heads around this, but it does take some, maybe some kind of training or some kind of commitment to say like, okay, I'm going to sit down and do this course or this training and like really understand like the basics of object oriented programming. This is also, I think it's a side effect, but it's kind of as far as what Drupal was trying to do by going to an object oriented model, the intention was to get us off the island and get us on par with other modern PHP frameworks, to open up who might come into the Drupal community. So, we were more in line saying like, yeah, Drupal developers are hard to find, but if we follow these standard conventions, if we follow object-oriented programming principles, if we use Symfony as a underpinning of what we're building in Drupal, then it opens up the opportunity to say, like, when you're hiring someone, to say, well, you don't necessarily have to be like an expert in Drupal to be a good long-term fit in this organization or in this project. If you understand these concepts, then Drupal is just an API. Like, it's
Right.
more, it works just like everything else does. You come in and it's going to take you time to learn the Drupal APIs, but you understand these concepts, you can move more freely. In the same way, on the front end side, the idea, among many other benefits of moving to Twig, to say we're moving to a theming engine that is not specific to Drupal. We're using something that other projects use, that's used elsewhere. So you don't have to be Drupal expert to come in and begin to figure out what's going on with Drupal theming,
Yeah.
because it uses Twig. Now, I just want to caveat and say there's still a lot to learn on the back end with all the APIs, the same thing on the front end. So it's not like anyone is coming in and going to be a Drupal expert because they had experience with object-oriented programming, Symfony, or Twig on the front end. But it gives them an advantage, a big advantage compared to the Drupal 7 model, where there was a lot more Drupalisms. You hear about Drupalisms all the time, where it's, this is how Drupal does things, and it's not really how most other projects out there are doing it. That's my perspective.
Right on. So we're still at DrupalCon. We're middle of day two, close to the end of day two. Is there anything else notable that you've run into specifically related to Drupal 7 end of life and the future of the Drupal project that's worth sharing here?
I would just generally communicate what the vibe in the room was. It was a packed room to hear about the Drupal 7 end of life announcement. I think the security team was poking fun that they do this session, the security team update, every year. And I don't think they'd ever had a room that full, but it was
Yeah.
overflowing, standing room only. And I think people were generally very happy to hear that it had been extended, but I also got the impression that people were happy that they were saying, like, this is the final decision. I think the uncertainty hurt things, hurt people, or made it hard for people to navigate, especially in organizations with their bosses, and to really communicate like the seriousness with certainty, and I think that's their goal in providing this. And, the vibe that I felt in the room and talking to people that were in the room was like, maybe that was the biggest change. I know I came into this saying, like, moving the date is not enough. What else are we doing? And the partnership programs is one answer, but setting the firm date is another answer. Now, I think that I and other people will be upset if they change this date, but they swear, on and off the record, they swear that this date is not changing. So I'm going to take them at their
Yeah.
word and operate with that in mind. But I hope that with that change and the others that were mentioned, like, we're in for I expect that we're going to see an acceleration in the transition now from
Yeah.
organizations beginning to move. Okay, now we have our marching orders.
I wholeheartedly agree. And just to go back to where we started the podcast, which is if you are planning these things and you want some consult, feel free to reach out to us. There's a lot of people that are working on trying to solve this problem of how do we help people that are on Drupal 7 get to Drupal 10, or get from Drupal 7 to Backdrop, or get from Drupal 7 to a static site generator. There's a lot of good options out there. And we're really interested to see not just that we want to try to generate business out of this, but we want to see the decision making that's going into it and try to have curious conversations around it. So we'd love to talk to you. That was also not in Mark's plans, but I just think it's important because I want to know, why are we making the decisions we're making? So we're seeing people that are moving from Drupal 7 to WordPress. We're seeing these things, and I'm really curious to enter into the conversation around why. And now we have a trigger. There's a timeline where we have to make this decision. So again, feel free to reach out to us or Mark directly. And
I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thank you, Dave. It's been great seeing everyone at DrupalCon. We'll have more, I'm sure, discussions coming out of all that we've done and seen here. And happy DrupalCon.
yeah, cheers, everybody.